Hello and welcome to The Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, Zuriel Oduwole, one of the world's youngest filmmakers and advocates for girls' rights and the youngest person in the world to be featured in Forbes magazine. In the course of her work promoting education for girls, she's interviewed more than 31 heads of state and statesmen, and the first that Zuriel met when she was just 9 years old was a leader she described as one of the most inspiring figures from recent African history, the former Ghanaian President Zuriel Rawlings, who has died at the age of 73. She calls him Grandpa Rawlings, and today she honors his memory. And later, the divided United States and what is turning into a merry-go-round of politics, if only its consequences were not so serious in a country suffering from the world's highest coronavirus infection and mortality rate. The president-elect Joe Biden and his team are getting increasingly frustrated with Donald Trump's refusal to concede, blocking what traditionally has been a smooth transition from one administration to another. Amid clashes between opponents of Mr. Trump and his supporters who have marched to back his claims of fraud in the presidential election, there are growing calls urging Republicans to counter Mr. Trump's rigged election narrative. We'll speak to the popular Los Angeles on-air personality Felicia Morris coming up. So Ghana prepares to bury its great fallen tree and longest-serving leader, Zuriel Rawlings, one of Africa's most influential figures, and the country is poorer for it, as President Nana Akufo-Addo put it. At the time Flight Lieutenant Zuriel Rawlings got involved in national politics, Ghana was in the throes of food shortages and a dire economic situation that had led to rampant inflation. People remember him for leading by transformative example. Many years later, the filmmaker and the girl-child education activist Zuriel Oduwole would be touched by the magic and charisma of President Rawlings. At the age of just 9, she met him. He was the very first statesman she met and recorded an interview with on camera. She went on to meet him several more times, as well as 31 other heads of state and global statesmen. But she's never forgotten her inspiring encounters with President Rawlings. In a moment, we'll speak to the small but mighty Zuriel Oduwole. But first, here's a short tribute she put together on Twitter in memory of the one she fondly calls Grandpa Rawlings. A short tribute there from Zuriel Oduwole in memory of the man she calls Grandpa Rawlings. Well, even in such sad circumstances, I'm delighted to welcome the world-famous filmmaker and girl-child education advocate Zuriel Oduwole, who joins me from California. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And you were just 9 when you first met President Rawlings at such an incredibly young age. What do you remember of that first encounter with him?
Well, thanks for having me. Good morning from Los Angeles, I guess. And yeah, I was 9 when I first met him. He was the first president that I sat down with. It's a funny story, actually, because whenever I go through interviews, people always ask me, like, how did everything start? Like, what's the first thing you did? Like, where did all this begin? And it's always the exact same story. I had a school project here in California of my school, It was a national competition, and they were asking students to make a documentary on a particular topic in history. And the year that I entered, it was revolutions that happened in history. And I always wanted to be different from the rest of my peers. And so instead of doing something like on the American Revolution or revolutions in Europe, I decided to go revolution on the African continent. And through research, I found out that the Ghanaian Revolution was one of the most successful held on the continent. So that became the topic of my documentary. And of course, making documentaries, you have to have primary and secondary sources. So I thought, wouldn't it be amazing to meet with the person who actually started the revolution? So I did my research. I found out that Flight Lieutenant Zuriel Rawlings started the revolution. And at the time I was doing my documentary, he was then President Rawlings. And so I wrote a letter to his office explaining who I was, how I had this whole documentary project. And a couple of weeks later, I got a note back from his office, and President Rawlings had said, okay, if you're serious about meeting with me for this documentary, then you've got to come to Ghana. So after selling that idea to my parents, we had to go around, do some fundraising, but I was able to go to Ghana for that project, and I was able to meet with President Rawlings. And I remember in my first meeting, I was very nervous. I mean, I was only 9 years old. I hadn't done anything like this before. But I remember that, I walked into his office. They said, okay, he'll be with you in a minute. And I remember he only has 10 minutes to give to you right now. Because I remember everyone was telling me he's just very, very busy, very, very busy. It's only going to be 10 minutes. So I was waiting in his office, and then he walks in. And of course, very, very nervous. And but I remember he tried to ease my nerves. I know one thing he did was he asked me, where I should sit, even though it was his office. He was looking around, okay, where do you want me to sit? How do you want me to be? How do you want this all to go? I remember he was very patient when I was setting up my camera and getting everything ready. And was very, very generous with his time. I know everyone kept saying that he had only 10 minutes, just 10 minutes. He's a busy person, which, I can imagine. But he ended up spending over an hour with me just for this one documentary project. He was answering all my questions in details. He even went on to explain things that I hadn't asked, but just to help me to get a better understanding about him and about the revolution as well. So I remember one of my first meetings with him would be that one. And I know whenever anyone asks me about memorable world leaders I've ever met, I always bring up him because he was the first president that I met with and I sat down with.
Well, I have to say that is a really interesting story, and the way that you told it makes it even more so. And of course, let's face it, you are a fascinating young woman, and at the age of 9, to have gone to a president's office, that would have, made you look and in fact cement the fact that you are an incredibly precocious young woman. And of course you went on to meet him several times subsequently, and in one of your tweets you said he helped you to become a more courageous person. Tell us more about how he did that.
When I met President Zuriel Rawlings, there's been a lot that I have learned from him. I know that whenever I speak with him and I sat down with him, he's always talked about how sometimes, he said at least, some African leaders, he thinks they don't always do enough for their people, or how sometimes they try and stay in office when they should step aside for younger generations and become statesmen that advise their nation. I know, President Rawlings, he left quietly after his 2 terms were up. He lived in a modest house, modest office. And so he taught me a lot of lessons. I learned a lot from him. I know one of those things was leadership. He always encouraged me to showcase leadership skills in everything that I was doing, in all the work that I was doing, even outside of work. He always told me to demonstrate leadership, and he even talked about and encouraged me to not let my age get in the way of making change. I know another world leader that I worked with, President Felipe Nyusi of Mozambique. I met him back in 2018 while I was in this country for one of my projects. And, I always took the advice that President Zuriel Rawlings said to heart. And so I met with this world leader, and not wanting to let age get in the way of anything. I sat down with him and I spoke to him about, showing myself as an example of what an educated girl can do if she's allowed to stay in school until at least age 18 and not get married off at young ages. So I met with him, and even after I left his country, I was still in contact with his office and the First Lady's office. And I think it was about 16 months after that first meeting with him, Mozambique outlawed child marriage in the country. And I remember when I first saw that, I was thinking, like, first, that's an amazing feat. But then also, I was reminded by what President Jerry Rawlings always told me about not letting my age get in the way of making change. And so, if I had waited till like I was older, yeah, it might have taken a while to see that change.
Yeah, I can see this is a very very tough thing for you to accept. I guess, like many people, you're still struggling to come to terms with the fact that Jerry Rawlings has passed away. I mean, how did you hear of his passing?
I remember it was on the news, and I think my dad told me about it when I woke up in the morning. And so that's how I ended up hearing about it. And I was very sad by the news because I think last time I saw him was about a year ago. And I really did think that I was going to see him again because, he was always very, very generous of his time. Every time I went to Ghana, he always made sure to make time to meet with me and always ask about what I was doing in Ghana, what I was doing everywhere else in the world, what events I was doing, and what I've been up to recently.
And we're going to take a break in the next minute and a half or so. But I mean, beyond... Okay, we've got 30 seconds. So perhaps what I should ask you before we take the break and then come back to you again is, how have you been affected by his passing? Briefly.
I mean, briefly, it's hard to describe, I guess. I know that people always ask about a relationship, like you mentioned earlier. I always called him Grandpa Rawlings. It was like, I guess, like a grandparent to, I guess, the granddaughters kind of relationship that we had. So it was hard to hear about, definitely.
Okay, Zuriel, do stay with us. Would like to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the world-famous filmmaker and girl-child education advocate Zuriel Oduwole as she remembers Jerry Rawlings. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu, and my first guest today, the world-famous filmmaker and girl-child education advocate Zuriel Oduwole, has been paying special tribute to her good friend and mentor, President Jerry Rawlings of Ghana, who has died at the age of 73. She said of his passing on Twitter that it was a sad day. He was the first president she met when she was just 9. She went on to meet him several more times. She said he always made time for her and always gave her sound leadership advice. And possibly through the inspiration of the likes of Jerry Rawlings, Zuriel has become a world-famous figure at just 18, meeting dozens of heads of state, presidents, prime ministers, and statesmen, and helping to change the lives of thousands of young girls across Africa and the world through her education advocacy work. Truly inspiring stuff from a young woman who at the age of 18 has already accomplished what many dream of achieving in a lifetime. And Zuriel Oduwole is still with me from California. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And President Rawlings' demise appears to have come rather suddenly. Were you aware that he was ill, or was it a bit of a surprise for you as it was for many people?
No, I think it was definitely a surprise. I think one thing I've learned through all of this is, like, if I were to ask you what time is it right now, you'd probably look at your watch or look at your phone and then tell me what you saw. I mean, I'm sure most people would probably do that. But what I've been learning is that whenever someone asks what time it is, that's time to really look at your life and look at what you've done, what you're doing, and also what you've yet to do. I say this because I think I last met President Rawlings about a year ago. And when I last met with him, I did think that I was going to see him again because, every time I went to Ghana, he always made sure to make time for me and make time to always meet with me so that way we could catch up and he could hear about the things that I was doing. And I know this must be a very, very sad time, and I'm very sorry to his family, Mrs. Konadu, his wife, his 3 daughters, and also his son. I know I met one of his daughters, Amina, when I went to visit his offices one time. She's also a very kind and cool person. But I know this must be a very sad and rough time for his family, and then also for the people of Ghana and even people across the continent as well.
And obviously sad for you as well. I mean, there are reports that he was diagnosed with COVID-19. I wonder what you might have heard about that.
I didn't hear anything about that from here, honestly. And I guess that's why it came as a shock to me when I did hear of his passing yesterday or a couple days ago.
And I mean, let's talk a bit about yourself, because obviously this is an opportunity, even though obviously you're paying tribute to your great mentor there. But according to the reports I've read about you, by the age of 13, you had helped make peace between Guyana and Venezuela. At 16, you helped end girl marriage in Mozambique. And at 17, you succeeded in getting Arab leaders to engage youths more. I mean, that's quite a lot for someone who's just 18, isn't it?
Some would say that, yeah. But I know President Rawlings always encouraged me to keep working, like no matter what, to keep making sure that I was making change in everything that I did.
And I mean, where do things stand with your education right now? Because I have to say that, I mean, it's quite extraordinary that you found the time to do all these things, including, the films you made and, such as, the Ghana Revolution, A Promising Africa, all of that. I mean, did you skip school to do all these things, or were sort of they incorporated into your sort of school projects?
No, so for my, like when I was younger, so like from 9 to about when I graduated high school at 15, I was homeschooled for most of that time. And so that made it easier for me to travel and do all my various projects, do my filmmaking projects. But then now I'm at university, but what I usually do is I would write letters to my professors. I'd explain, the work that I do and how, I might need a couple of days to travel to this particular country to do work there, but then how obviously whenever I come back, I'd catch up on my schoolwork and things like that. So all the stuff that you mentioned recently with the Guyana, there, me meeting with President David Granger to talk about add my voice to the peace initiative between his country and Venezuela. And then in Mozambique, I did mention that as well with speaking to President Felipe Nyusi, adding my voice so that way he can see, what girls in this country should be able to accomplish and should be able to do if they're allowed to go to school and get an education as well. And then with President El-Sisi of Egypt, I met with him as a youth, and we're talking about the power of youth and how youth around the world, especially in his country and neighboring Arab countries as well, can play a major role in the futures of their countries with regards to policy making and implementing positive change.
So, I mean, where are you attending university at the moment?
Right now, I'm at UCLA.
Okay, and I mean, just listening to you talk, it just sounds like, a young girl who's done extraordinary things. I mean, what's next for Zuriel Oduwole beyond obviously getting a degree?
Beyond the degree, I'd have to say, definitely I'll be continuing my child education advocacy work, especially my girl child education advocacy work, until we start to see a lot more girls on the African continent and also in other countries as well, starting to have the same opportunities as boys and also being allowed to go to school and get education so that way they can have more opportunities when they get older. So that's definitely something I'm going to be continuing. And then also I would have to say, so aside from the degree and going to med school, one thing that I want to do when I get much, much, much older is I want to become the President of the United States of America, because I want to have a positive effect in this country and also a positive influence on policies that are made in other countries as well. I remember when I first told that to President Jerry Rawlings, and he said that he was very proud. And I know we just had a lot of fond memories together. No, I think the first time I brought that up was the third time I met with him. And that was actually a funny time, or a funny story, I guess, that goes with that. I mentioned President Rawlings always makes time for me whenever I go to the country. And this one time when I was in the country, I happened to have been leaving Ghana the same day that he was flying back, I believe from a state funeral. And, you know, I went to his office earlier in the day, and then they were like, they're not sure if it's going to work because he's actually flying in later on that day. It's about the same time that your flight is leaving this evening. And so I was just like, okay, I guess this one time, this one trip, you know, maybe I won't meet with President Rawlings. But I guess work was going on behind the scenes, because I remember on the way to the airport, some of the people from his office called and said, let us know when you get to the airport and wait in the departure hall. So we got there, we called them, we told them where we were, and then suddenly these people just came out and escorted us to this sort of like lounge area. And we were waiting there, I wasn't quite sure why. And then they told us, you know, don't worry, President Rawlings' flight is coming in soon. We want to make sure that you have time to still meet him before you fly out of the country. And, you know, I was, you know, very grateful that he was making the time to meet with me. But I remember in the back of my mind, I was also thinking, my flight's going to take off soon. It was actually really funny. So he landed, I was still looking at my watch, looking at my phone, not looking at the time, because I knew that I had a flight to catch. And so, you know, he showed up, we spent some time together. That's when he asked me what plans I have for the future. I brought up becoming the president of the United States one day. So I was very proud of that. I spent a lot of time talking with him. I met his wife during that encounter as well. She's a very cool and funny lady. And then I remember throughout this entire meeting, like I was really glad to see him, but I was still looking at my phone. I was looking at the time because I could hear, I guess like on the PA system in the airport, they were announcing the final boarding call for my flight. And I know flights don't wait for people. And so I was just thinking, okay, you know, I still have a flight to catch. And in our meeting, I remember one of his aides came over to him and said, okay, President Rawlings, she has to go. She has a flight to catch. He was like, okay, just 1 minute. And then he continued talking to me. And honestly, I was enjoying the conversation. And then eventually he said, okay, she has to go. Like the flight, they've called, last call for the flight. He said, okay. And then I remember he looked at the same aide and said, make sure she gets on that flight, okay. And so we said our goodbyes. We took pictures. And then they had this car waiting out on the tarmac. So the aide escorted us to the car. We got in the car.
Okay, we have to go in a minute.
Yeah? Oh, no, it's fine. Let me just finish off this story quickly. So we got in the car. We were driving like alongside airplanes, I guess. And what had happened was he had already backed out from the gate and it was waiting out on the runway. But I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but he made sure that we were still on that flight. They had to get trucks to like drive it.
Zuriel, I hate to interrupt you, but we're actually out of time. But thank you very much indeed for sharing those very special moments with us.